Civil unrest and instability trend upward around the globe. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. Lately, if you've began to feel like the world is becoming a more hostile place, you may have been onto something, according to a recent study. There's a new article that's been put out by CNBC that states that the world is likely to face new levels of civil unrest in 2020. The headline reads that 40% of the world's countries will witness civil unrest in 2020. They go on to claim that almost a quarter of the world's countries witnessed a surge in protest and unrest last year, which was 2019, and that figure is set to rise further, according to the study they cite. Now, the study was conducted by a consulting firm called Maplecroft, so I would say it's wise to take the findings with a grain of salt. They are a company, and they do have a motivation at play here. We're going to see that near the end, but first, before we dig deeper into the article, it's important to lay out a couple of things. First, the very definition of civil unrest is quite flexible. One of the more popular ways of expressing the idea is to define it as this, as an activity arising from mass acts of civil disobedience in which the participants become hostile towards authority and authorities incur difficulties in maintaining public safety and order. So, there's a lot of things that can be bucketed into that. If you try to be super flexible and you want to increase this number, if you want to say civil unrest is rising to unfathomable levels, you may bucket in something like the Raptors' victory celebration in Toronto. When those people started celebrating in these streets, let's go through the list here. So, civil disobedience. They were jumping around on top of vehicles, vandalizing things, and there are even people who were directly confronting authorities. People who are jumping on police cruisers and whatnot. The authorities definitely had a difficulty in maintaining the public peace, safety, and order that night. Now, to any reasonable person, that obviously is not a sign of civil unrest. We would interpret that term to mean something more dramatic, like a large portion of the population rising up in conflict against an authoritarian government. But if you want to be flexible, you can technically find a way to argue that the Raptors' victory celebration was an example of civil unrest. That's on one side of the spectrum, something that you would say is more frivolous, and on the other side, we have something like Hong Kong, a piece of the country who is fighting desperately for their rights of autonomy and to not be bullied by China. That is also civil unrest. So we're not too sure exactly what they've classified as unrest and what they haven't, but that's why I say we should take the results with a grain of salt. Something like the Raptors parade celebration, or even what happened in Toronto a couple months ago, where protesters were fighting against the public library for allowing a controversial speaker to speak about feminism and the trans movement. Maybe that could be civil unrest to some people, but I'm sure the masses wouldn't identify that as a great cause of concern, especially when you have things like the Hong Kong protests going on as comparison. The second thing that we should clarify is that many parts of the world have largely been in a state of civil disorder for centuries right now. This is truer for some countries than others, but it's not really inherently a bad thing to be in a state like that. Actually, what it does signify is that the populace is looking for a change and they're willing to fight for it. That could be a good thing, actually, and civil unrest really is a mechanism for bringing about a society's vision into the government, especially when the government is not willing to comply through other means, and you do have to raise your voice to a high level. Look at Hong Kong again as an example of that. The people are tired of being bullied by China. They are fighting for freedom, and that is very inspiring. The civil unrest in Hong Kong is a good thing, I would argue. It would actually be negative if the people were not doing anything. If they were to shut up and let China have their way and they didn't do anything to fight for their values, that would be a true sad situation. So as you can see, sometimes civil unrest could be a source of inspiration. It could signify a good thing coming. But at the same time, it might not. So you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. The reason why I'm saying this, though, is because I don't want people to hear this headline that 40% of the countries in the world are going to face civil unrest, and then you let that depress you. You start to feel hopeless, because it's not really the case. Essentially, these cases here of civil unrest don't necessarily spell doom. It could be a source of hope and a source of change. It signifies that the people are willing to fight for what they believe in. If you look back on history, most monumental changes in society, shifts in the way people think and the way we operate, have come as a result of civil disobedience. And I should probably mention that I'm also not just trying to be an anarchist here. I'm not one for destroying all types of government and ripping up the system from the top down, but there are certain cases where you have to do that. I would prefer it if there wasn't civil unrest, if society was a happy place for everybody, but that's not the reality. So, now back to the article. CNBC writes that there are 195 countries, if you include the Vatican and Palestine, and of that sum, 47 witnessed a rise in civil unrest in 2019. That's about 24% of the countries on the list. Now, the consulting firm used some data that we aren't entirely aware of, a combination of socioeconomic and political analysis to arrive at their conclusion. And via that, they say, in 2020, it will be 75 countries who fit the criteria, not just 47 anymore. And that brings the percentage up to 38%, which is roughly 40%, and that's what they say in the headline. You know the media, you always gotta round up to make the numbers look a little bit more intimidating. So, the firm identified Hong Kong and Chile as two countries who had the highest amount of growth in civil unrest in this time frame. So, Hong Kong is obviously taking on China right now. That's been pretty well covered, but Chile, they haven't gotten as much attention. That situation there is equally interesting. So, supposedly, the protests were triggered by a raise in subway fare. The cost to ride the bus went up, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. The people weren't just mad at that they had to pay an extra 25 cents or whatever to ride the train. It was in combination with the cost of living rising, privatization being a trend, and inequality. All these things underline the protests. So, people said, as a response to the increase, that we are not going to pay these subway fares, and the government, in response, brought in their military. That is not a proportional response to the situation, and obviously the protesters got mad. That escalated things, and people responded by fighting back against the government. They vandalized these subways, and it even got to the point where protesters were burning them down. Now, that's where I would say things got a little bit out of hand. It was the tax dollars that built the subway, and you destroying them is kind of like you destroying your own property, but I digress. So, 81 subway stations suffered major damage as a result. Now, the president, in response to that, declared a state of emergency, and the army rolled in with a new degree of fervor. Their new mandate was to uphold the peace and vanquish the threat of rebellion. That mandate has not gone too well, and other measures like curfews were even introduced. These are regarded as some of the worst civil demonstrations in recent Chilean history, just so you have a point of reference. And an estimated 1 million people took to these streets to protest the president. As a result, 29 protesters have died since then. Nearly 2,500 were injured, and 2,800 have been arrested. Those jails must be getting awfully packed with all those protesters taking up space. The government's not doing a good job of focusing on criminals in that regard. Now, there have also been additional accusations of sexual abuse and torture, and those have come out against the government forces. The protesters don't feel good dealing with a regime who is okay with that kind of behavior. And that's really just a small glimpse of what's going on there. Now, even Iran is facing massive civil unrest. Protesters are looking for governmental change there, and the regime has killed some of them as a result. They've killed people who have advocated in the streets for change. In regards to Hong Kong and Chile, the report says that they aren't expected to find peace for another 2 years. So, buckle up. Things will likely get worse before they start to get better. And there are other countries too on this list who are considered high risk, and that includes Nigeria, Lebanon, Bolivia, Ethiopia, India, Pakistan, Sudan, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. Each of these places has deep-rooted problems, and clashes are foreseeable. Here's a little gist of some of those problems. In Nigeria, last year, the Islamic movement of Nigeria clashed with the police. In Lebanon, this week, protesters were fighting against dollar restrictions on bank withdrawals and got hit with tear gas by armed forces. In Bolivia, citizens are protesting against supposed electoral fraud. They believe the people in power rigged the vote, and they're violating the citizens' right to have their voices heard. In Ethiopia, an activist posted about a violation of a security detail, and a clash broke out between supporters in a rival group who who are believed to work on behalf of a prominent politician. In India, people are protesting the Citizenship Amendment Act. That was very controversial, and people took to social media to protest that too here in North America. And the list continues for quite some time. I believe you get the gist from that. There are a lot of places in the world, and some of them are going through some very bad times right now. As a result of this unrest, it's predicted that a deterioration in stability will occur. Now that is an obvious side effect when you consider what protests like this do. You have the populace in open conflict with the government most of the time. They are fighting for an upheaval, for a major change in the system, and they are determined to get it done. They're going to fight for it, and oftentimes they're willing to die. They put their lives on the line for the change they desire. It's admirable, and it's what people have to do when they are boxed into a corner. That occurs largely due to the government's fault, because they've created a system where the populace feels like they have no other means of recourse, and this is what happens because of that. Now, they also counted in the study for an interesting variable: the danger of protesters suffering human rights abuses or sharp responses from security forces. And before we even get into that, I think it's getting too dark. So I want to mention too that oftentimes, not in every case, there are some examples I listed where the motive of the protesters is bad, but in most of these occurrences here, the people are fighting for something positive. They want to bring about a good change, like in Hong Kong, like in Iran, like in a lot of these places. They want to remove a corrupt government from having too much influence on them. They want to be free. And it might sound like a bad thing right now. There are people who are getting arrested, people are dying, but the end game is a positive upwards motion. Hopefully they get there, and that's the role of us. We have to support protesters who have a good cause. Now, if you have a bad cause, like certain countries, and people are fighting for the wrong thing, then yes, you have to bring that up and support the right party. Maybe it's the government. Oftentimes it's unlikely to be them, and more usually it's the citizen, the populace who are voicing a change they want to see. So there is hope in that. Now, back to what I was talking about. There are some countries on this list who have a high risk of doing something like creating human rights abuses or responding with security forces to the threat of a protest. There are lots of problems in places like that, but some countries are willing to go the extra mile and lock down people to the point where they fear for their lives if they step out of line. That was common among dictatorships and authoritarian regimes in the past, but today, countries like that still exist. So, who did the study identify? Some of these high-risk countries include Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Thailand, and Brazil. It's a dangerous game to step out of bound and try to fight against the government because they might just kill you. They might just administer a horrific human rights abuse to get you to shut up. It's a dangerous game for the government too because it creates an environment where a boiling point must be reached before action occurs. There is no steady escalation. There is no dialogue. When people are snapping, it's because they've had it and they are not going to bargain with you anymore. For citizens to band together and fight against the Chinese or Russian or Saudi Arabian government, it's going to be at a massive cost to everyone. Calling for the government to be removed, that's when you know the people are willing to put it all on the line because of the way the government will typically react to it. They're going to kill people. They're going to do what they can to silence you. But if people are still willing to fight for that, even though it's a legitimate path to suicide, that's how you know they're fighting for a cause that's dear to them. The perceived gain that they are envisioning, the change that they want, is worth it at any cost. They are willing to fight, and if there are risks associated with it, well, that's the price, and that's how you enter a game of chicken. The protesters, the civilians, they're not going to change their mind anymore. You didn't give them that chance. You silenced them until the point of no return. Now, the government was willing to commit grievous offenses to keep you quiet. They're going to do those same things to you when you talk as well. It's a losing battle for everybody, and that's why we cannot tolerate and support regimes like that. People should not be afraid of the government. The government has to fear the people. It's a basic concept of freedom. Without that in the equation, you are living in an authoritarian regime. Examples like the countries I mentioned really do cement why things like freedom of speech, rights to peacefully protest, and democracy are vital to a successful country in today's day and age. Governments hold tremendous power, that's a fact, and these powers need to be held in check via these tools here. If you erode freedom of speech, the government absorbs that surplus power and can control the narrative. they make it a crime to say certain things, to not say certain things, to think certain things. It's a losing game. Now, if you erode democracy and the government tells you who runs the show, that's a bad situation too. They'll tell you they know what's best for you, even if they don't, and they'll force you to believe it. Then, if you erode the right to peacefully protest, and now what you're going to do is you're going to force people to fester negative emotions for a very long time, until they reach that breaking point. They have to be able to express themselves early and to have their voice heard. Otherwise, you risk the formation of a full-out rebellion in the future. These core tenets of Western civilization and democracy and government are nothing short of a miracle. People who undermine them actively do a disservice not only to themselves, but to their country overall. These things are worth preserving and fighting for. A lot of people around the world will kill to have this opportunity. Now, MSNBC ends the article with an odd touch. They write that there will be an increased pressure on global firms to exercise corporate responsibility, especially in these countries here who are suffering from unrest. And my response to that is to simply say, what? What are you talking about? Corporations are the last stakeholder that needs to enter the equation. Do they believe that companies will not exploit the situation? When unrest and stability are high, it's an opportunity to rebuild. Companies will insert themselves and find ways to make profit in that situation. That is not a goal we need to have right now in those countries. The very foundation of those societies is in question. They need to figure out a just governmental system free of monetary considerations they have promised to figure out without the pressure of a corporation mounting in the background. What social responsibility can a company even offer? What are they suggesting? Giving a donation? Donations that will be taken likely by the corrupt government that the people are fighting against? There's a time and place for the market, but this is not it. Arguably, corporations have made tensions worse in many of those regions already. This year, 2020, it can either be an inflection point where things get better and global communities fight for better conditions for themselves, or where the world falls into a period of vast turmoil. In Canada, we have it relatively good right now, but we have to be aware of the effects of things like political polarization. Fighting over things that really aren't that monumental, or even fighting just for the sake of fighting. To see people who think differently strictly as an enemy who needs to be vanquished, these are all mistakes that we cannot risk committing. Right now is a good time to work towards unity so we don't descend down to the path of places like America, who I actually believe is on the verge of civil unrest themselves. There's a lot going wrong in the world right now, and it really comes down to the society, the individuals. We really have to change the way we look at things. Our philosophy on philosophy. Our philosophy on the ways that we are allowed to think and interact with each other. We can't let the boiling point reach new heights every day amongst each other. Polarization is doing that. Social media is playing a part in that equation as well, and getting heated, getting riled up in things like cancel culture and whatnot. It's fighting a losing battle, and we really have to ground ourselves and think about what is truly important and what are we trying to do in our lifetime. So, that now brings me to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoy the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That will help us grow. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Perri Platform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.